Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground and the suspension's hanging. After that, if you have a hubcap, remove that now. Once you have that out of the way, continue on to each of your 4 21mm lug nuts. Remove the 4 and then the wheel. Now let's move along to the back side of the caliper. We're going to be looking for 2 17mm headed bolts holding the bracket to the knuckle. Remove the pair. While you have it off, inspect your brake pads. If it looks like they're worn at an angle or they need to be replaced, now's a good time to do it. Aside from that, assuming it looks good, let's hang the caliper aside so it's putting no pressure on the flex hose. All right, let's grab onto the rotor and remove it. Have a look at the back side. You want to make sure that you clean the mating surface of the rotor along here and the mating surface of your wheel hub. Now let's move along to removing our tie rod end. Typically, you're going to find that you have a cotter pin. Take that out of there, use a 17mm, remove the nut, give this a couple loving bonks to break it free. This one's pretty rotted, so I'm just going to break it off. Now once you have the nut off of there, put it back on a couple good threads. We'll spray this area with some penetrant, let it sit, and then we'll give it those loving bonks. Inspect your tie rod end, make sure there's no damage. Now at this point, you can pivot the steering knuckle as needed. We'll continue on along the backside and remove this 14mm bolt. After you have it out of there, go ahead and give everything a little wiggle. We're trying to make sure we separate the brake flex hose and the ABS wire bracket from the backside of the strut. Now we can continue on with the ABS wire itself. Follow it over to where the mounting point is on the strut. You can either use a small screwdriver or a pick. Go ahead and separate this area. Now to do the ball joint, you don't necessarily have to remove the ABS sensor from the knuckle. Typically, you can just very carefully remove the knuckle and slip it up and hang it from the strut. For me personally, I'm going to be removing the ABS sensor. Once you have the bolt out of there, continue on with some penetrant. We'll give it a little wiggle and try to remove it from the knuckle. When you remove it, be extremely careful not to damage this area. That's the sensing agent. Now we can carefully set this aside, making sure we're putting no pressure on the line itself. At this point, we're ready to continue on to our axle nut. Looking at it, you can tell it's a 12 point. You want to use a 12-point 30mm socket. Continue on with a hammer and punch, come right in the center of the axle. We're going to carefully try to drive it out of the bearing. Once you know you've got plenty of movement, we can continue on up along the top here. To remove each of our mounting bolts, we're going to use 2 19mm. We'll use a wrench on one side and a socket on the other. It's a good idea to leave the top bolt in there and continue on to the lower. With both of the nuts off of there, we'll continue on by removing the bolts. As you remove them, keep in mind, this is going to want to swing down. When it swings down, you need to also be pressing the axle through the bearing. If you do not, you could potentially damage the axle. Now let's move down to where the ball joint connects onto the knuckle. Looking at it, you're going to find some sort of cotter pin. Remove the cotter pin and then the mounting nut. Once you have the cotter pin off of there, use a 19mm socket to remove your ball joint nut. Once you have it off of there, continue on by starting the nut on a few good threads. Now, you're going to have to separate the steering knuckle from the lower ball joint. When you do this, there's several ways of doing it. Commonly, people will use a pickle fork. They're going to come right in between this area and try to separate it. If you're not replacing the ball joint, you're going to ruin the boot, in which case, typically you have to replace the ball joint. Otherwise, if you happen to have a stud puller of some sort, you can go right over this, squeeze it down, and that should press the stud out and through the steering knuckle. We're going to be replacing the ball joint, so for me, I'll continue with a pickle fork. Now we can get over to the bench. Now that we're over at the bench, let's have a look at the back side of the knuckle. You'll notice that mine's nice and wet. I sprayed it down with some Penetrant. The reason why I did that is because all the way along the back side of this knuckle, there's a snap ring that holds the bearing in place. Now for that snap ring, you're going to want to go ahead and take a punch and a hammer, come along one of the ears. There's two ears. One here, one right there. Pick the first one. Go ahead and put the punch on it, give it a couple loving bonks with your hammer to try breaking it free. Make your way over to the other side, do the exact same thing. Now once it feels as though it's broken free on either side, you can continue on with some snap ring pliers. For the snap ring pliers, we're going to come straight down into each of those two ears. Once I'm in there, I'm going to carefully squeeze this. Something to keep in mind while you're doing this is a snap ring. It's under spring pressure, trying to force out. So while I squeeze it, it's going to be trying to come out of the tool and potentially out of this area. So watch your eyes. I'll give it a little squeeze. You can see it's starting to separate. Now you can carefully stick a screwdriver or something you might happen to have inside this area and gently start trying to pry it up and out. Once it comes up, you should be able to release the snap ring and finish removing it. Once you have your snap ring out of there, give it a close inspection. Make sure it's not rotted, weak, damaged in any way. If it is, you need to replace it. This one looks fine, so I'm going to go ahead and take it to the wire wheel, clean it up, and put it aside. All right, we're over at the press. Let's get this into position. Now, once you have it in position, the next thing you want to do is make sure that it's centered. We want to make sure that as we drive this down, we're going to be pressing out the hub, which is in the center of the wheel bearing. Now that we have the hub out of there, we're going to continue by pressing the bearing out through the back of the steering knuckle. You want to make sure you put this as flat as possible. Once you feel as though you have it on there, continue on with a cup that feels like it fits just over the bearing itself. Now we'll use an adapter. We'll get everything leveled out and start pressing it down and out. So now that we have the bearing out of there, the next thing you want to do is thoroughly inspect the hole where the bearing's supposed to go. While you're inspecting the hole, make sure you clean the area where the snap ring needs to go as well. It's important to make sure that when you put the snap ring in, it's going to be in there holding the bearing in place. Now once you have the knuckle clean, it's going to be time to install your brand new wheel bearing. When you're installing the wheel bearing, you want to make sure you put it in through the back side of the knuckle. And as you press it down and in, you want to make sure you're as straight and flat as possible. Now what you want to do when you're pressing this in is to only press along the outer metallic ridge here. You never want to press on the seal that's along here, the black area, or even the center, only along the outside aspect. With that said, you can continue on with the original outer bearing casing. We'll place that right over, make sure it's lined up as straight as possible, and now we can start pressing this down. Now, as I was pressing it down, I found that it went down extremely easy. Once it got to the very bottom, where it bottomed out, it got a little harder. That essentially means that I'm bottomed out. I'm just going to give it a little bit of extra pressure here, and then I'll release the pressure and check it. Once you have it off of there, you want to pay attention to the slot on the back side of the knuckle where the snap ring is supposed to go. You need to be able to put the snap ring in there. If the bearing's sticking up to the point that you can't put in the snap ring, you need to continue pressing it in. We'll take a look from the front side here, and as you can tell, it's pressed in perfectly all the way around. And I did not damage the center point right here. It's not trying to protrude out. This looks good. Let's continue. Got my snap ring cleaned and ready to install. I'll place it down into the knuckle, take my snap ring pliers, and we're going to carefully squeeze on those two ears that I showed you before. As I'm squeezing it, I'm going to keep in the back of my head that this will be under spring pressure. I don't want it to shoot off and potentially hurt me. I'm going to carefully start pressing this down, making sure that I'm not going to put my fingers in any pinch points. Release that snap ring and inspect it. Make sure it's completely seated all the way around the knuckle. At this point, we know for sure that the snap ring's in place properly. We can continue by pressing the hub into the bearing. Of course, when we're installing this, you want to make sure you have the hub facing towards where the front of this would be. Now, as I have that lined up with the center of the bearing, the next thing we're going to do is start pressing the bearing down onto the hub. So you'll notice down where the hub's on the base here, I have it raised up, so I'm not going to put any pressure on any of my lug studs. I don't want to damage them. Now, when I start pressing this down, this is an important part, you need to make sure you only press on the center portion now. We're not pressing on the outer portion, and we're definitely not pressing on the seal. I'll just find an adapter that fits on that perfectly. I'll place in my spacer that brings it up to where I need it to be. We'll line everything up as straight as possible and carefully start pressing it down. As I'm pressing this down, I'm making sure that it's not under extreme pressure. Why am I worried about that? If it was under pressure, typically that means I'm not going straight. If I'm not going straight, I could potentially damage something. So while I'm doing it, I'm also going to be turning this a little bit. You don't need to spin it like that, but at least make sure that it does actually move and it's not binding in any way. All right, so right there it felt as though it stopped wanting to go in any further. At this point, I want to make sure that it's definitely not bound in any way. Assuming you're safe enough, go ahead and take a peek under this area. Make sure it doesn't look like it's twisted, turned, or damaged. This looks perfect. Let's continue by removing it from the press. Now at this point, we have the hub pressed into the brand new bearing and we're ready to get back over to the vehicle. Now we can take our knuckle and we'll put it right onto that lower ball joint. Take your ball joint nut, put it onto the ball joint stud. Now we're going to bottom this out and then we're going to torque it to manufacturer's specification. Now that we started the nut on there, we'll bottom this out and then we're going to torque this to 72 foot-pounds. The next thing we have to do is hold the knuckle still so we can continue torquing the ball joint without spinning on us. I'll use a nice long pry bar, come straight on through that wheel bearing hole. Now let's continue with some copper never sees. We're going to come right along the back side of the wheel bearing. Try to spray it into the splined hole so when we put in the axle, we'll be sure to be able to get it out in the future if needed. Carefully grab that axle, slide it into the back here, and then put the knuckle into its proper position. We should see the axle coming out through the front. Now we'll turn the strut as needed so it lines up with the knuckle. Go ahead and slide that right into position. Once you have it lined up, continue on by putting in your mounting bolts. You'll notice that I cleaned the threads and I applied some red thread locker. Start on both of your mounting nuts. Bottom each of these out and then torque them to 97 foot-pounds. Let's continue on with some copper never sees along the mating surface of our bearing hub. Let's take our brake rotor and slide it onto the hub. Hold it in place with one of your lug nuts. Clean your caliper bracket mounting bolts, apply some red thread locker, and install your caliper with bracket. We'll slide that right on over the rotor here, start in both of our mounting bolts, snug them up, and then torque each of these to 65 foot-pounds. Move along the back side of your strut. We're going to get ready to remount our ABS wire and flex hose. Make sure you clean the mounting bolt and apply some copper never sees. For mounting this, you want to make sure you mount the ABS bracket first. Looking at the bottom, you can see you have a little mounting piton here, and then up along the top you have a hook. Let's slide the bottom into the groove along the bottom of the strut. Swing the top up and over, the hook should sit right into place and the bolt hole should line up. After that, take the flex hose, slide it right on over, and then start in your mounting bolt. Make sure it's completely secured. Remount your ABS sensor. For the mounting bolt, you never want to use red thread locker. Only use copper never sees. Let's snug this. Right there, it feels like it bottomed out. Let's take it a teeny bit further, keeping in mind that you do not want to damage the ABS sensor in any way. Let's finish securing that ABS wire. Make sure it's completely secure and there's no way it can get hung up or caught on anything while you're driving down the road. Now we can go ahead and put in our outer tie rod end. Let's slide that up and into the knuckle. Once you have it in there, continue on by putting on your mounting nut. Now we'll bottom this out and then torque it to 36 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, the next thing you want to do is pay attention to the hole that's in the tie rod stud. Also, pay attention to all the slots that are on the tie rod nut. You need to make sure that one of the slots lines up with the corresponding hole in the stud. If for some reason one is not, continue tightening the nut until the very next slot does. Once you've got it in the proper placement, continue on with a brand new locking cotter pin. We'll slide that right on through. Peen it over. Then just peen this over so there's no way this nut can loosen up while you're driving down the road. Okay, the next thing you want to do is continue on to installing your axle nut. For the axle nut, make sure you go ahead and put it on here by hand and bottom it out. Once you have it bottomed out, bring your vehicle closer to the ground. You'll notice that I have a pry bar coming across some of my lug studs. I put it as flat as possible so I don't damage the studs. The reason why I have the bar here is to make sure that this does not spin on me while I continue torquing the axle nut. We'll torque the axle nut to 159 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, pay attention to the slot on the axle shaft itself. What you want to do is take a hammer and punch and peen the nut down into that slot. That's going to prevent this from loosening up on you while you're driving down the road. That looks good. Okay, so at this point we're almost ready to put the wheel back on. But before you do, double check everything. Make sure your flex hose and your ABS wire are not twisted, they're not tangled, and they're definitely mounted properly. Also, double check to make sure you torqued everything. Assuming it looks good, let's grab the wheel and get ready for installation. Remove your lug nut. Let's get the wheel back up on here. We'll start on all 4 of our lug nuts, get the wheel safely back on the ground, and then torque all of the lug nuts to 76 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely on the ground, let's continue torquing these to that 76 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. Assuming you have a hubcap, go ahead and put that on now. The area that you want to pay attention to for your hubcaps is the area for the valve stem. Line that up, put it in position up against the rim, and drive it in. Make sure it's secured all the way around so it doesn't fall off while you're driving down the road.